Bread is supposed to be the easiest thing in the trolley to trust. It is flour, water, yeast, salt, maybe a little thyme, maybe a little fermentation, and that should be the end of the story. But that is not the story most UK supermarket bread is actually telling. Because the modern bread aisle does not really sell bread first. It sells softness, familiarity, shelf performance, sandwich reliability, kid appeal, and the comforting illusion that if a loaf looks ordinary enough, it must also be simple. That is where a lot of people get caught. Not because they are careless, but because bread is one of the last products shoppers still think of as too basic to require investigation. And once you start turning these packs around, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. So this is not a panic piece, and it is not a claim that every loaf from every major bakery is the same. It is much simpler than that. If you are trying to buy bread that actually matches the clean, everyday image on the front of the pack, these are 9 UK bread brands I would avoid in their mainstream packaged loaf lines. Not because bread should be a purity contest, and not because every additive automatically makes a loaf evil, but because the category keeps using the same trust shortcuts. A bakery name, a farmhouse queue, a family image, a white soft slice that feels safe, and then, on the back, a formulation built to last longer, travel farther, stay softer, and behave more predictably than most shoppers probably imagine. The first pattern in this case file is the biggest one of all. Familiarity gets mistaken for simplicity. The more normal a loaf looks, the less people inspect it. And that is exactly why the biggest names often get the least scrutiny. The first brand I would put back is Warburton's. That one will surprise a lot of people because Warburton's has mastered the language of everyday trust. It feels almost built into the British kitchen at this point. The brand image is family, routine, dependability, the standard loaf that has been there forever. But that is exactly why it matters to read past the front. On a typical medium white loaf, you are not just looking at wheat flour, water, yeast, and salt. You are also looking at vegetable oils, including palm, soya flour, a preservative, emulsifiers, and a flour treatment agent. Now, none of that means the loaf is some kind of mystery object. It means something much more important for shoppers. The loaf is being engineered for consistent softness, mold control, handling, and shelf stability in a way that does not really match the plain, humble image most people bring to bread. The issue is not that it contains ingredients with technical names. The issue is that one of the most trusted basic foods in the aisle is no longer especially basic. And watch what the loaf itself teaches you. It bends without resistance. It compresses into near-perfect uniformity. It toasts evenly, sandwiches neatly, and keeps that gentle bounce long after a simpler loaf might start to dry out. That texture feels convenient, but it also tells you what the formulation has been optimized to do. Not nourish a bread tradition, perform a retail function. When shoppers buy Warburton's as the safe, obvious choice, they are often paying for familiarity more than clarity. That is why it makes this list. Second is Hovis, and Hovis is a great example of the same trust pattern wearing slightly different clothes. Hovis has history on its side. It leans into the heritage of bread, the national memory of the loaf, the idea that this is not just a product but a staple with roots. But again, look at what the mainstream soft white offering actually asks you to accept. The ingredient list includes soya flour, a preservative, emulsifiers, and rapeseed oil. The front gives you softness and comfort. The back gives you a formulation built for softness and comfort. That difference matters, because the branding encourages you to think of the product as a bakery staple when the ingredient logic is much closer to industrial standardization. This is where people often say, well, of course mass-market bread needs to survive transport. Exactly, and that is the point. Once you admit that, you stop treating the bread aisle like a simple food aisle and start treating it like a manufacturing aisle. Hovis is not on this list because it is uniquely bad. It is on this list because it helps normalize a category-wide deception of expectation. The loaf looks like an ordinary staple. The formulation behaves like a logistics product. And if you buy it believing the front-of-pack feeling tells you the whole truth, you are not really buying bread with your eyes open. Pause on that for a second, because this is where the entire category starts to make more sense. Flour fortification in UK bread is not the scandal here. Bread law and standard enrichment are not the main issue. The bigger issue is the extra architecture built around that base. Oils, emulsifiers, preservatives, treatment agents, texture supports. A loaf can still be edible, legal, and popular while being far more engineered than the average buyer assumes. That gap between legal and transparent is where most of this list lives. The next pattern is Health Halo by Partial Upgrade. This is where brands know shoppers are getting more suspicious of plain white bread, so they offer loaves that sound smarter without becoming radically simpler. More fiber, half-whole meal, farmhouse styling, a more wholesome shelf identity. But the structure underneath often stays very close to the same industrial logic. Third on the list is Kingsmill, specifically the kind of loaf that sounds like a clever compromise. This is why 50/50 products are so revealing. They are marketed as family-friendly middle ground, the loaf for people who want something a little better without the bits, heaviness, or resistance of full whole meal. And to be fair, that promise is attractive. It sounds practical. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like progress. But once you flip the pack, the underlying formula still leans heavily on the usual support system: vegetable oils, soya flour, an emulsifier, a preservative, and a flour treatment agent. So yes, you may be getting more wholemeal flour in the mix, but you are still buying into the same softness and shelf performance machine. That is why this matters. A partial upgrade can calm a shopper without really changing the category logic. Kingsmill's 50/50 image works because it speaks directly to parental compromise. Better than white, easier than brown, accepted by the whole family. But the more responsible the front sounds, the more dangerous it is to stop reading there. A bread brand does not become transparent just because it found a more reassuring angle. Sometimes the healthier-sounding loaf is actually more useful to the brand than to the buyer, because it reduces guilt while keeping the industrial template intact. That is not the same thing as an honest improvement. It is often just a softer landing. Fourth is Jackson's of Yorkshire, because this is where the category gets more sophisticated. Jackson's is not selling the same blunt familiarity as the big white slice giants. It often leans into craft cues, bloomers, Yorkshire identity, a stronger crust image, a more premium feeling on shelf, and that works. The packaging, the loaf shape, even the name itself suggest you are stepping slightly closer to bakery bread and slightly farther from factory bread. But when you look at products like its bloomer lines, you still see the same deeper pattern: emulsifiers, oil, flour treatment support, and a structure designed to create a very specific retail-ready experience. This one matters because premium styling is one of the easiest ways to switch off scrutiny. A shopper sees a taller loaf, a dusted crust, a seated top, a more handsome bag, and suddenly the bread feels less processed before the ingredient list has even been checked. That is a dangerous psychological shortcut. Premium is not the same as simpler. Rustic is not the same as minimally handled. And a bloomer silhouette does not magically erase industrial support ingredients. In fact, the better a loaf looks on shelf, the more careful you should become, because the visual design may be doing a lot of the persuasion that the formulation cannot do on its own. And this is where the pattern gets sharper. Bread brands are no longer just selling a loaf. They are selling a story you can feel with your hands before you ever read a word. A squishy slice says kid-friendly. A flour-dusted crust says artisanal. A family name says trust. A wholesome color palette says better choice. The front is emotional. The back is operational. Once you see that split, you stop shopping the same way. The third major pattern is tradition theater. This is not fake in the sense that the brands have no history. Many of them do. The problem is how history gets used. A bakery legacy can become cover for a formula that is much more modern, much more optimized, and much less straightforward than the branding suggests. Fifth on the list is Roberts. Roberts is a perfect case study because the brand identity carries that bakery heritage weight. It sounds like a proper bakery. It feels regional, grounded, familiar. But a typical soft white loaf still brings along soya flour, emulsifiers, a preservative specifically there to inhibit mold growth, rapeseed oil, and a flour treatment agent. That is not a crime. It is a signal. It tells you that the loaf you are buying is not simply an old-school bakery staple scaled up for convenience. It is a managed retail product using bakery nostalgia as emotional packaging. And notice how little it takes to create that emotional packaging. A surname brand, a warm palette, a few words about quality. That is often enough. The average shopper is not standing in the aisle saying, "I demand a fermentation timeline." They are reading vibe. That is why Roberts lands on this list. Not because it is the most extreme example, but because it shows how effective bakery heritage can be at disguising a thoroughly modern loaf logic. It is one of those brands people assume they understand before they actually do. Sixth is Baker Street, and this one reveals a different side of the bread problem. Baker Street is about convenience stretched almost to absurdity. Long Life bread has a very specific sales pitch. It tells you that what you really want from bread is not freshness, but availability. The loaf that sits in the cupboard, the rolls that wait for barbecue season, the pack that survives travel, storage, and timing errors. That can sound practical, and sometimes it is. But it also pushes bread even further away from what most people instinctively think bread should be. The brand itself talks about core bread ingredients inside a clever packing process. That phrase alone should make you slow down. Clever for whom? Convenient in what sense? Optimized for what kind of buyer behavior? The issue with Baker Street is not that shelf stability exists. It is that shelf stability is being reframed as a lifestyle advantage, while the category quietly redefines what bread is allowed to become. Bread stops being a fresh product with a short, obvious lifespan and becomes something closer to a packaged platform for convenience. At that point, you are not just buying a loaf. You are buying distance from the bakery model altogether. And if your goal is honest, minimally complicated bread, that is usually a brand to avoid. Now here is the midpoint reality check. None of these 6 brands need to be cartoon villains for the pattern to be real. That is the wrong lens. The smarter lens is to ask what the category rewards. It rewards softness that survives. It rewards visual trust. It rewards familiar names. It rewards loaves that can be shipped, stacked, squeezed, sliced, and still present as fresh enough. Once you understand that incentive structure, the next part of the list becomes painfully predictable. Because the fourth pattern is standardization at the value end. This is where supermarket own-label bread exposes the machinery most openly. The comforting myth is that branded loaves are more engineered, while the basic supermarket loaf is just plain bread at a better price. In practice, the cheaper end often makes the formula logic more obvious, not less. Seventh on the list is Tesco's own brand soft white loaf range. This is where a lot of buyers tell themselves a very simple story. It is supermarket bread. It is basic. It is cheap. Therefore, it must be straightforward. But the product pages for these kinds of loaves commonly list the now familiar architecture: wheat flour, water, yeast, salt, soya flour, spirit vinegar, emulsifier, rapeseed oil, flour treatment support. In other words, the lower price point does not automatically mean a shorter route back to real bread. It often just means you are seeing the industrial model without the heritage storytelling on top. And that is actually useful to learn. Tesco own-brand bread makes the whole category easier to decode because it strips away some of the romance. The loaf is there to be affordable, soft, stackable, and predictable. If you are buying it in full awareness of that trade-off, fair enough. But many shoppers still treat the plain supermarket loaf as if it were the least manipulated option in the aisle. Often, it is simply the least decorated version of the same system. Eighth is Morrison's own brand white sliced bread. And again, the reason it lands here is not because it is uniquely outrageous. It is because the ingredient logic continues to repeat. Typical listings for these loaves include soya flour and a preservative alongside the standard base, and that should immediately reset the way you think about just a normal loaf. The phrase normal loaf does a lot of damage in this category. It lowers attention. It makes people stop reading. It turns a processed retail product into something emotionally invisible. Morrison's is useful as an example because supermarket bread is where convenience becomes so familiar that shoppers stop seeing it as a choice. A loaf goes in the trolley almost on autopilot. The bag feels light, the crust looks uniform, the slices are perfectly obedient, and the price makes the whole thing feel too ordinary to question. But ordinary is exactly the disguise. If a loaf has been built to hold softness, inhibit mold, and behave identically from one shop to the next, then you are not looking at simplicity. You are looking at silent optimization. That is a very different thing. Ninth is Sainsbury's own brand soft white and farmhouse-style mainstream loaves. And this is an important one because Sainsbury's shows how quickly farmhouse or soft white language can create a false sense of downgrading the industrial feel. The wording sounds gentler, slightly more traditional, slightly more homely, but the ingredients on these kinds of loaves can still include things like fermented wheat flour, spirit vinegar, rapeseed oil, and treatment support built around texture and consistency. Again, this does not mean the loaf is dangerous. It means the image and the logic are not the same thing. This is the part of the video where some people realize they have been using the wrong question. The wrong question is, which of these breads is secretly toxic? That question does not help you shop better. The better question is, which of these breads is pretending to be simpler than it really is? That question changes everything, because once you ask it, the aisle looks different, the colors look different, the family branding looks different. Even the softness feels different. What once looked like reassurance starts to look like design. And now the final pattern becomes obvious. The deeper problem is not one bad brand. It is that the mainstream packaged bread category has trained people to accept distance from real bread as long as that distance arrives wrapped in familiarity. Warburton's does it through household trust. Hovis does it through heritage. Kingsmill does it through family compromise and better-for-you positioning. Jackson's does it through premium craft cues. Roberts does it through bakery tradition. Baker Street does it through convenience innovation. Tesco, Morrison's, and Sainsbury's do it through the invisibility of own-label normality. Different shelf personalities. Same basic consumer outcome. You think you are buying a staple. You are often buying a performance formula. That is why this title matters more than it sounds. Avoid does not have to mean panic. It can simply mean stop rewarding bread that hides behind the wrong promise. If a loaf presents itself like a basic kitchen essential but behaves like an engineered shelf object, maybe it does not deserve automatic trust anymore. If a bread brand borrows the language of simplicity while relying on a long support structure to create texture and lifespan, maybe it should not be your default just because it is familiar. And if a product only looks honest from the front, then honesty is not really what is being sold. Here is the practical rule that can save you from most of this aisle in under 10 seconds. First, stop reading the front of the pack as if it is evidence. Soft, farmhouse, white, 50-50, bloomer, baked with care, family favorite, Yorkshire, since whatever year. None of that tells you whether the loaf is simple. It tells you what emotional lane the brand wants to occupy. Second, find the ingredient list and look for what has been added to manage texture, shelf life, and uniformity. Oils, emulsifiers, preservatives, treatment agents, vague support architecture. Third, ask whether the loaf's physical behavior matches what real bread would normally do. Does it spring back almost unnaturally? Does it stay pillowy for suspiciously long? Does every slice feel engineered to the point of impersonality? Those are clues, not verdicts, but they are useful clues. Then use one more filter that almost nobody talks about. Ask what problem the loaf is really solving. If the answer is, I need bread that tastes like bread, that points you one way. If the answer is, I need bread that survives a week, a lunchbox, a freezer, a squeeze, and a rushed breakfast, that points you another. There is nothing wrong with choosing convenience. The mistake is choosing convenience while telling yourself you chose simplicity. Those are not the same purchase. And one more thing, because this is where shoppers can actually get smarter without becoming obsessive. You do not need to memorize every additive code. You do not need to become the most intense person in the bakery aisle. You just need a better definition of what counts as a trustworthy loaf. Trustworthy bread is not bread with the nicest branding. It is bread whose product reality matches the feeling it sells. If a loaf looks plain, and the ingredients are plain, fair enough. If it looks premium and the formulation is still heavily managed, that is a clue. If it sells compromise as improvement, but keeps the same structural supports underneath, that is a clue too. And if a brand relies on the fact that almost nobody checks bread carefully, that alone should make you check it more carefully. So the 9 UK bread brands I would avoid in their mainstream loaf lines are Warburton's, Hovis, Kingsmill, Jackson's of Yorkshire, Roberts, Baker Street, Tesco own brand, Morrison's own brand, and Sainsbury's own brand. Not because every loaf they make is identical, not because bread has to be purified into a trend, and not because one slice is a catastrophe. They make this list because they keep showing the same deeper category problem. The front of the pack suggests one kind of product, while the ingredient logic often suggests another. And when a staple food starts leaning that hard on emotional disguise, shoppers deserve to notice. If you want, the next time you are in the bread aisle, do a quiet test. Pick up the loaf you always buy. Then pick up a loaf that actually looks a little less polished, a little less branded, maybe a little shorter lived, maybe a little less pillowy perfect. Read both backs. Feel both expectations changing in real time. That is the moment this whole category starts to click. And I want to know what happens when you do. Which bread brand fooled you the longest? Which loaf do you still buy anyway because convenience wins? And which category should we audit next? Wraps, bagels, crumpets, or supermarket healthy snacks that look cleaner than they really are? Drop your own bread aisle experiences in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of everyday product people stop questioning right up until they finally turn the pack around.